So it's wonderful to be talking to Dr. Ed Armston-Sherry for this morning's interview, which is about a character from the OH community who, appallingly, we didn't know an awful lot about. But when I got the email from you, Ed, first of all, about Cyril Longhurst, I was very excited about this because what a figure, what a character.
Yeah, he's a really interesting figure, and he plays a key role in Scott and Shackleton's first expedition to Antarctica. So this is the Discovery expedition, which was the brainchild of the Royal Geographical Society's president, Sir Clements Markham. And it's because of Markham that Cyril Longhurst kind of comes onto the scene. And I think Markham knew Longhurst's family and was looking for someone to work as the expedition secretary. And so Cyril takes on that role shortly after the expedition sort of gets financial backing from the government in June 1899, and then he goes on to work for the expedition throughout its duration, right up until 1904. And then he's a really key person in the expedition. He manages all its accounts, most of its correspondence, lots of the logistical stuff of ensuring everyone gets paid. And then he makes friends with a lot of the explorers. I think at one stage, Captain Scott asks for a photograph of Cyril when he's in Antarctica because he obviously missed him because they shared an office together for so long. And then after Shackleton gets back, he marries Emily Dorman, and Cyril Longhurst is his best man. So he's quite a sort of key, but not necessarily well-remembered figure in the history of this.
That's what's really interesting about this, because as you say, all this work in the background, and sometimes all the work in the background is equally as important sometimes to all these things, particularly if you're going on an expedition like Scott did. Just wanted to talk a bit about the book, because what inspired you to write this book? I mean, The Grip of the Ice, its launch is fairly soon, 29th of this month. Tell us a bit more about the background to why you wrote it.
So I wrote the book, I guess, because I'd always been fascinated by stories about Antarctic exploration and always been really interested in the history of exploration more generally. And I did a PhD, which was looking at exploration more generally across different environments and in different contexts. And the Discovery expedition just really sort of stood out to me as an expedition where there's been quite a lot of really specialist polar writing on the subject, and quite a lot of, and I think at one stage it was very well known, but it's kind of just got a bit overshadowed by Scott's death on the way back from the South Pole in 1912, or Shackleton's leadership after the sinking of the Endurance. But I guess these later stories don't really make that much sense without the Discovery expedition, because this expedition is so key to understanding why are Scott and Shackleton polar explorers in the first place. If you'd gone back to 1895 and asked people who's likely to be the first person at the South Pole, Scott or Shackleton would not have been anywhere on anyone's list, because they really had no experience at that point, and not necessarily a massive interest in going to Antarctica. And the Discovery expedition changes that. It's Markham, Clements Markham, the RGS president, basically insists that it's kind of run largely by the Navy and staffed by naval officers and sailors, and Shackleton manages to get on through a personal connection with a donor. So it's kind of this really fortuitous combination of circumstances that leads to these two men becoming Antarctic explorers. And without this expedition, we might know their names, but I don't think it would be in connection with Antarctica.
That is absolutely fascinating, all these things. And like you say, a lot of times, these things happen per chance. Things just happen and it's just in the right place, right time, all comes together kind of thing. All of those things are fascinating. While you were doing research and pulling all these bits together, it must have been quite interesting from sort of these. Obviously, we're talking quite some time ago, and there's probably fairly good records, but it must have been quite interesting pulling it all together and sort of, matching it all up and finding the story, what was actually really there,
Yeah, I think what I found difficult on that front were I think there's a lot of records, but I think that records are a bit dominated by the voices of the officers and scientists on the expedition, because they had more time to write diaries, better literacy. They had their own private cabin to write their diary in, with a desk, whereas the sailors were sleeping in hammocks. So there was a bit of a discrepancy in terms of like whose experiences on the expedition it's easy to research. And in writing the book, I also wanted to make sure to include some of the voices of the sort of sailors who did so much of the work on this journey to Antarctica. So I think that was a bit of a challenge, and it was using the sailors, limited records, but also reading the officers' accounts for mentions of what's happening to the sailors. They often would say, oh, this person's got frostbite or suffering with their eyes and things like that. And so you just had to piece things together from multiple sources. And when it came to Longhurst, I think one of the challenges is that so much of the writing about the expedition is by Longhurst. So he's in all these meetings, all these committee meetings when they're organising the expedition, in all these sort of meetings, but he's often just taking the minutes. So he's there, and he is really, really important in terms of getting everything actioned afterwards. But his actual feelings, he doesn't really put them in writing that much. You do find the occasional bits here and there where he says, like, oh, I'm really tired, or this person's being a bit difficult, and things like that. But he went on to become quite a senior civil servant, and you get the sense his real skills, as well as being very organised and diplomatic. He was very good. I think adapting himself to quite a few different managers, different leaders, and not making necessarily a big fuss about quite difficult situations, because he did face there was a real clash between the Royal Society and the Royal Geographical Society, who were organising the expedition but had different visions of it. And Longhurst kind of in the middle of this, trying to use all his diplomatic skills to stop everyone arguing and actually bring it together to organise an expedition.
Maybe he learned some of those skills All Hallows. I think the school knows, but not necessarily. We worked out these days the most academic careers, but certainly working with people, and certainly what would you have been doing. Although maybe it was more academic back then, I don't know.